So hi everyone, my name's Ali Shir. I'm so grateful to be participating in this talk, and I'm so grateful also to my coworkers from Microsoft who I see on the line and some friends that are on the line as well. So thanks everyone for being here. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this topic in particular, and specifically how learning to sell can actually make you a better designer, is because, as Sheila mentioned, something that many people don't know about me, especially here in Israel, is that I actually started my career in sales. And although I will not pretend to be an expert in sales at all, it was quite a brief stint. I actually was able to learn a lot of really valuable lessons from my time in sales, and have been able to draw some different parallels between the disciplines of design and sales, and specifically have learned some great techniques and how to leverage those into my current day-to-day as a product designer at Microsoft with my great team. So before we jump into that, I just want to give you guys, for those of you that don't actually know me, a little bit of background on myself and the accent that you're hearing. So I'm originally from California. And although I spent like a year living in France, the last 3.5 years I've actually spent here in Tel Aviv. And I want to share with you guys my story today because I think my story is one actually of transformation, like of a very unlikely path into the current work that I do today. But many people wouldn't actually know that, because if you look at my CV or my LinkedIn profile, it looks one of maybe like a typical product designer. So what you'd see is that, I started my career at LinkedIn, which was then acquired by Microsoft during my time there. And at the time I was like, yeah, Microsoft is such a big company, and I want to go to Israel, and I want to work for a smaller company. I want to work for kind of a startup. So I worked at a company called WalkMe for a year, then moved over to Booking.com, where I was for almost 2 years. And then, funny and amazingly enough, ended up back at Microsoft, but here in the ILDC, the Israel Development Center. So as I mentioned, this might look like the profile of a typical product designer. But what most people don't actually know is that before I entered the field of design, I actually started my career in retail sales. So what happened is I was 17 years old and I wanted to be a fashion designer. And like most 17-year-olds who are about to enter uni, especially in the United States, I didn't really know how to break into the field. I had no formal education. It was just kind of a pipe dream of mine. And I was able to get an internship at a clothing brand and store based out of Los Angeles called American Rag. But again, I was working with buyers and really had no skills. I was only 17. They put me out on the sales floor. And this was a great experience because it really allowed me to connect the dots to understand what we were doing upstairs in the buyer's office, and ultimately what consumers were interacting with, and how they were consuming our product downstairs in the store. So my internship ended and I was about to start my degree when I actually went to a barbecue at my best friend's house at the time. And I knew she was doing something kind of weird over the summer, like some multi-level marketing type of gig. And I didn't really know exactly what it was. And I went to her house and I started chatting with her manager. And I soon figured out that what she was doing was she was actually selling knives. And Cutco, probably for a lot of you guys that don't know, because this is truly an American thing, is basically a multi-level knife marketing company where you go and you sell knives to your friends and friends of friends. And I was actually challenging her manager on why this was a total ripoff. I'm like, I know these knives cost X amount and you're selling them for X amount, so there must be a huge markup. And this is a scam. And he started challenging me on why exactly I thought that. Instead of getting angry, instead of getting upset, he really started challenging me and asking me a lot of interesting questions. So I thought to myself, you know what, maybe there's something I can learn from him. Maybe in the month between when my internship ended and when I start my degree, I can actually learn something. So something very embarrassing that my brothers hold against me all the time is actually, for 1 month, I did pretty much door-to-door knife sales. So very random and very strange, I must admit. But I actually learned some really interesting takeaways from this experience selling knives, which actually brought me to my next sales job. So I was in university, and I actually just needed some money. And I was, again, still kind of considering going into fashion, but again, didn't have so many skills. So I got a job selling high-end clothing at Nordstrom, which, for you guys have visited the States, is a high-end retailer. And in my first day working at Nordstrom, I actually sold about $10,000 worth of merchandise. And this isn't to say that I'm the best salesperson ever, but what I did is I actually observed the top seller on the sales floor, and I saw the way she was interacting with customers and the way that she was asking insightful questions. So all I did was actually copy what she was doing. And this led me to be number two in sales in the store on my first day at work. So again, there's a formula, there's a recipe that's tried and true, and it's something that has then translated later into my career, and that's what I hope to share with you today. So what I really hope that you guys can all get out of this is not the classic like sell yourself and sell your work and that's how you'll be a better designer. No, I actually really aim that we can have a conversation together on how to leverage some of the more advanced sales techniques in the way that you can bring it into the way that you think about developing your products. And more specifically, the ways in which you can engage with your team and create an environment of questioning and of user-centered design. So before we jump into this, I just want to give you a brief history on sales and specifically salespeople so that we can get a better understanding of where some of these newer techniques came from. So my first question to you guys is, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about sales or salespeople in particular? So if no one wants to answer that question specifically, we can take it to Q&A. But just to give you a little bit of a background, this is kind of the first image that we have in the United States, at least, about salespeople. And this is the quintessential snake oil salesman. So this salesman is someone who lies and who creates false cures. And actually, there's an expression in English when you say that you're selling snake oil to someone, it's you're selling something false. And we've seen this again come up again and again in popular culture. So for example, The Wolf of Wall Street, if you guys have seen that movie, tells the classic tale of an amazing salesman who was able to manipulate an entire market into essentially buying nothing but smoke and mirrors. And then this, maybe this is something that we can relate to a little bit more in Israeli culture, but it's the classic idea of someone post-army going to the United States, taking advantage of those stupid Americans and selling them Dead Sea products. I know my manager, Yair, who's on the call, loves to laugh about this specifically, but this is some of the images that we have of salespeople. And I know for myself, this is something that I definitely thought of salespeople as well. But there's a different type of sales, and this is actually a very strategic B2B sale. And this is something that I saw at LinkedIn, and it's something that we see at Microsoft, and it's something that we see across B2B systems that are selling complex software, and also in consumer apps as well. And this is more what I want to focus on. So when I started LinkedIn, I actually started in a rotational program. So I didn't start off in design. I started off in a program for people that had an interest and had some skills in various areas and were really trying to figure out what it is they wanted to do. So again, something that a lot of people in Israel don't know about me is I actually spent a short period of time doing sales at LinkedIn, being part of a greater sales team. And these skills taught me a lot about what exactly it takes and some of the methodologies that ultimately can then help you connect to the greater product that you're designing for. So one of the big lessons I learned, and I hope that you guys can take this away from my what I just told you, is it's really important to share your story. And why is it important to share your story? Well, it's important not only to, again, sell yourself, and also sell your work better as a designer. But ultimately, sharing your story will help you design products that are more relatable. So Seth Godin, who is a very famous marketer, if you don't know him, he has some amazing content out there. He talks about building a product or service that matters with a built-in story and then sharing the story. So this is something that I like to think about, whether I'm actually in the creation and ideation process, whether I'm sharing my designs with my team, or whether I'm simply collaborating with the engineers and product managers and other designers that I work with every day. And actually, a success story that I can share with you guys about an experience where I shared my story in product development was when I entered a hackathon about 6 months ago that was aimed at Olim. And essentially what this hackathon really wanted to do was create products that could essentially help new immigrants in Israel. So I'm obviously a new immigrant of 3.5 years here. So I could relate to the topic. And the outcome of the hackathon was that my team won first place. Now, we definitely didn't have the best technology. Actually, we put together this really hacky solution. We had like some cool design and presentation, but what we did really well that ultimately allowed us to win these giant TVs, which was the prize, but more than anything, the pride that came with it was the ability that we as a team were able to share our story. So we got up there and we started talking about one of the biggest challenges that Olim have when they move here. And that's loneliness. And that's the feeling of not connecting with the people and the places that they love and the things that they love. So we talked about a story where when one of the guys on our team first moved here, all he wanted was a place to find peanut butter, his favorite peanut butter. And that was 10 years ago, and it was really difficult to find at the time. So wouldn't it be amazing if there was a product that could help you find peanut butter? Because we knew it was here, we just didn't know where to find it. And so we told that story as we were in the room designing, as the designer, myself, and the engineers were working together, and ultimately when we presented to the judges. And that proved to be really powerful. Now, something else that I learned in sales, and this is going to be the greater topic that I really want to dig into, is around the concept of solution selling. So ultimately, solution selling was a methodology that became really popular in the 1980s, and it had a pretty simple formula. So essentially, the salesperson would diagnose the prospect's needs, and then it would make a recommendation on the right products or services to fill those needs. Now, there have been some challenges to this method, and some people say it's outdated. But essentially, if you look at the core of solution selling, it's a lot of what we as designers do every single day. So one thing we do is we identify these common pain points, we develop in-depth questions, and we really start to look at the value that we can create by the products that we are designing. So right now, what I want to do with you guys is I want to go through some of the key components of this solution selling that I've identified as helpful in the work that I do and the work that my team does currently at Microsoft. And we can go through these different steps and I can give you some examples. And afterwards in the Q&A, we can have a bit of a discussion on this. So the first thing is defining the actual problem that you're trying to solve. And where this goes in specifically is defining the pain points. So there's a methodology called SPIN. Again, it's just one of the many B2B sales methodologies. And it starts out by aiming to understand the prospect's current situation. So as designers, we're aiming to understand the user's current situations. And we'll do some research and we'll really get into it. But ultimately, we want to understand the problem that's at the heart of the issue, whether it be a prospect, a sales prospect, or a user. And then we want to go into the implications. So what would be the consequences if our user or our potential customer or our prospect does not have this problem solved? And then ultimately, we want to look at the needs payoff. So how would their situation change, either our prospect or our user, if the problem was solved? And this is something called SPIN, the situation, problem, implication, and need payoff. Does anyone see any familiarity with what we do as designers? Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. So Chris Do, who's a really famous design thinker in the industry, he talks about sales in the way of educating and entertaining. So he says, teach me how to use your product. What problem does it solve? Again, designers and salespeople ultimately were asking the same question. So when it came to presenting my team's hackathon project, we framed our entire process around this methodology. Again, we didn't call it that, but as someone who was really driving the process, this was really at the core. You can tell, for those of you that might know me, the centerfold here is flaming hot Cheetos because it is my obsession. And this is something I currently talked about while we were designing this product. Like, I want these things so badly and I just don't know where to find it. And so we went through each of these steps in order to discuss the features that we were actually going to build and how we were ultimately going to present it. Now, the next step of the process is developing the right types of questions and really trying to understand the types of questions that we need to ask in order to really speak to our users on a personal level. And in order to do that, you really need to understand your audience and your users. So again, whether you're in sales or whether you are designing a product, understanding your users is at the core of essentially what we do. Again, nothing new here. But what I want to do is draw some parallels between what I've seen between buyer personas and how in product design we actually frame different user personas. So it's quite interesting. In sales, there's this concept of different buyer personas. So the first buyer persona is someone known as a gatekeeper. So normally the gatekeeper is someone like an executive assistant or someone who's an associate of the decision maker. And this is someone you really need to get through in order to get that initial meeting. Then there's an influencer. So an influencer is traditionally a junior level employee, and they're normally tasked at actually exploring the option before bringing it to their superior. And again, there's someone who's normally promoting your product internally and really trying to sell it for you. So again, this is someone that in sales, you really keep in close contact with. Then there's a persona called the blocker. So the blocker is essentially a lot of the same qualities as an influencer. Sometimes they're mid-level or they're in charge of actually evaluating the solution. But these are normally the people that will ghost you and they'll poke holes in every single one of your claims as a salesperson. And they're really, really challenging. But then ultimately you have the decision maker. And ultimately the decision maker is the person that signs the check. They're the person that says, yes, we want to buy this product for our organization. And they're ultimately the one, along with the rest of the team, that you have to convince, but ultimately they have the final say and signature. So does this look familiar to anyone? Do you see the parallels here between our user personas and our buyer personas? So I know in my current role, I'm working on Microsoft Azure right now, and it's a technical product, it's a B2B product, and ultimately, when we are going through the user personas of who is actually going to use our product, a lot of it has to do with thinking about, okay, these are our end users, but how do they fit into the buyer personas? Again, when you're at a larger organization, when you're selling into a larger organization, the personas might be different than when you're selling into a startup. But again, when I ask, VP of R&D is like, I work on alerting, like what if you had a magic wand, what would you create for our product? A lot of times they are also the buyer persona. So they're a user persona and a buyer persona. And so it's important to just understand the parallels between these two so that you can design a better product and think about ultimately the commercial viability of what you're designing. And again, the reason this is really important from a sales perspective or from a user perspective is because we have tons of potential users and we have tons of potential buyers, but ultimately we want to focus our efforts on the ones that matter. And that's why we have to be asking the right questions and really understanding who the buyer personas and the user personas are. And this is what we did when we created the hackathon project. So we had to understand who our audience was. Now, we knew we had a little insider information that one of the judges was Canadian. She's like a famous Canadian comedian. Her name is Rennie. We had heard through the grapevine she'd be a judge. And also, a lot of the people in the room were Olim, and they were French. So when I actually designed the screen, I designed it in a way that the people consuming it could actually identify with the communities that we were trying to cater to. So again, this isn't something like magical that I'm saying. It's really just saying know your audience, and whether you be in a hackathon, whether you're presenting your designs to your stakeholders, know your room, know your audience, and make sure that when you're telling your story, you're really telling your story and catering to the people that are consuming it. So another really interesting thing that I learned in sales is becoming an active listener. And so active listening is a really beautiful skill to develop, because it can serve you in your design career, in sales, if there's any salespeople on this call, in your relationships. And it's really about building rapport and making the person that you're speaking to know that you understand their world, that you understand their pain. And oftentimes listening can be really difficult, because all we want to do, especially when we're nervous, is like talk and never stop. But it's really important to actually have these active listening skills. And there's a few different aspects of active listening that are really interesting and that can help you in your everyday life. So one of the things is actually confirming that you heard the question or you understand the prompt correctly. So something I like to do currently is, I'm obviously a native English speaker working in a Hebrew speaking environment, although everyone switches to English for me. So sometimes I want to just make sure that myself and my product manager and my engineers and my design manager, that we're all on the same page. So what I do is I actually reflect back the words that the person I'm speaking to said to me. So things like this. So what I'm understanding from what we're talking about is that you think that we need to frame XYZ in this way. Yes, cool, great, we're good. And that way, I'm not just nodding my head like, yeah, product manager, like say whatever, I'm listening, but they see that I'm actively listening. The other thing is constantly asking clarifying questions. So I remember a few years ago, I was really afraid to ask questions because I felt that it made me, look bad or, unintelligent, or that I didn't know what I was talking about, even though I probably didn't. But it's really important to ask clarifying questions, because again, it shows the person that you're speaking to that you're actively listening to that. And this is something that I learned in sales. So I would be on the phone with potential prospects, and I maybe was talking to 20 or 25 people a day, which is a lot of people, and my head was starting to spin. But the way that people knew that I was listening to them and understanding their problem was with these skills of active listening. So this is something that I encourage every designer here working with their stakeholders, whether you're freelance, whether you're working with a product manager in a studio with your eng team, to really practice active listening skills in whatever language. And so one really interesting parallel that can be drawn from active listening and where it kind of originated was from this doctor named Carl Rogers, who had this kind of non-directive approach to therapy that he called client-centered therapy. And what he did is he actually created this technique that actually gave clients control of the process. So the therapist was just this non-judgmental, genuine, empathetic player in this conversation, and his approach and his hypothesis is that the clients could actually heal themselves. You just had to give them the tools and be the facilitator of that. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of sales, but also in terms of user research. So a user research that I worked with when I was at Booking had a really amazing approach of doing this in the way that she barely spoke. She would come into a room or over usertesting.com or however she was facilitating the user research, and she would just kind of present the design, and she would let people speak. And she would ask probing questions and practice reflective listening, but ultimately, she wouldn't prompt them too much. She just would let people come to their own conclusions. And then she would ask these very high level questions and ultimately extract the answers that we were looking for by just being an active listener. And she actually did this really interesting exercise that I'd never seen before, but definitely something I'm going to use in the future, where she actually broke down pieces of the design and she just let the users write down how they were feeling about each part. Again, not speaking too much to them, but just saying users ultimately know what they want. So let's just give them the opportunity and space to actually tell us. And then we can take that information and build exactly what they're asking for. So all of this is different ways to actually go ahead and create value. So creating, maintaining, and building value is something that's very important for us to do as designers. So you guys have probably heard before, like the difference between kind of like a pixel pusher designer and someone who's really strategic. And this is all encompassed by the ways that designers can actually bring value to the table and specifically to their product teams. So I want to just share with you guys an example of a product, like a feature more so, that I worked on in the past, where the sole purpose of our feature was to bring value to the users. And so when I was working at Booking, one of the main things that we were actually measured on was conversion. But we had this hypothesis that if we could just bring value to the users by helping them compare different properties, then this would actually make them more loyal to us and feel that we cared about them and that we wanted them to have a good experience and weren't just trying to push product on them all the time. So my team actually put forth this enormous amount of effort to create a product that was just there to compare different properties. And we added a match score. And again, the match score didn't really affect conversion in any way. It was just there for the pure sense of information and bringing value to the user. And so we actually saw a lot of engagement with this, and this was considered to be quite a successful product. And again, when it comes, just kind of drawing it back to the hackathon I participated in, when we presented like a notification feature, the question that we asked ourselves is, how can we bring the most value to our users here? What are the types of things that users actually care about? So what we did is we actually created a feature that would alert users on price fluctuation, because what we found is that that's what users cared about the most. When a new product was added, and how much it cost and what the price fluctuation was. So this was something that when we actually showed it in the demo, the audience identified really well with, and we heard a bunch of oohs and ahs, and that's really cool. So again, currently in my day-to-day at Microsoft, even though I'm working on a totally different product, it's not a consumer product, it's a B2B product for developers. Something I'm always challenging my team to think about is, okay, we're building this, we're reorganizing this, but how are we bringing value to our users? What does the user persona actually care about? And these are the same questions that salespeople are consistently asking themselves when they're presenting types of information and doing consultative sales to their prospects, to their prospective clients. Now, the last point I'm gonna make is about relationship building. And this is less so about the actual product design itself, but it's more so about some of the things that I've learned from working in sales, but also from some really strong people on my teams that can help you build better relationships with the design team or studio that you work with, or the developers or product that you work with as well. So building relationships is something that there's a different approach to, depending on who you ask is the best sales technique. I want to kind of just bring up one technique we didn't talk about, but it's very important regarding relationship building because it's a different approach. And what I would like to suggest is an approach between the spin methodology and the challenger methodology, which is, again, a very different sales approach. So essentially, what the spin methodology, the first methodology we saw taught, is that it's important to ask these questions and then bring a solution to the user. And again, it's having more of a different type of demeanor in your approach. Whereas the challenger methodology is a new type of sales methodology that is more along the lines of bringing new ideas and finding creative and innovative ways to help a customer's business, in the sense that the salesperson is not afraid to ultimately challenge the prospect. And so the reason why this, actually in a study that was done, and this is the whole point of the book, The Challenger Sale, has shown that challenger salespeople are ultimately the most successful, is that they bring new and unique perspectives. And so for you guys as Israelis, and I guess me kind of as well, because I've been living here a while, Israelis aren't afraid to challenge convention and to bring up what's wrong. But actually in the United States, this is something that is not so seen. It's not seen as often as it is in Israel, in the sense that people ultimately shake their head and are agreeable, especially designers. Maybe something about our demeanors in general, we're a little less aggressive, and we're not as afraid. I mean, we're more afraid in the United States to actually challenge ideas. But this actually drives a really strong two-way communication street. So ultimately, what the book argues is that if you understand the individual's value proposition and what they're trying to go to, but you're not afraid to ultimately challenge them and have a little chutzpah, which again, Israelis don't have so much trouble with, that ultimately you will be more successful in developing these relationships. So in my current work, how I've actually found this effective is working with my product manager. So I'm really lucky enough to work with an excellent product manager where I don't feel afraid to challenge him on ideas. And also with engineering, it's the same thing. I think a few years ago, before I started implementing these sales methodologies onto my design tactic, I would have been much more wary to challenge a product manager or an engineer, you know, and not just challenge them in a way that's aggressive and not adding value, but really bring up different things that challenge convention. Because ultimately design is something that brings everything together. And if you're a strategic product designer, you can do this in a way where the product, engineering, and design intersect in a very harmonious fashion. And I've actually found that by using these different techniques of reflective listening, of being a challenger, but again, not in an aggressive way, but more in a strategic way, that I've been able to provide a lot of value to my team. And we've actually built a really strong relationship because of it. And lastly, the last point I want to make on relationships is that both selling and designing is a team sport. So something that's been really great that I've observed is that when teams win together, and when you give credit where credit is due, there's no amount that can be accomplished. Like nothing can't be accomplished through that. And there's a really great example of like a story where whenever I'm presenting an idea that is a great idea, but it's not necessarily mine, or someone else helped me develop it, I never hesitate to bring up the name of the person who initially suggested it or who I developed it with. Because there's no sense in not giving someone else credit where they deserve it, right? Ultimately, it helps you build relationships and helps you win together. And so again, this is something that we all know, but maybe sometimes we forget because of insecurity or because we want to, you know, show our dominance and how great of a designer we are. But what I've seen be really successful in my current team is that everyone is there, and there's especially a few people I can think of in general that are really there to uplift each other and to help each other succeed, because when one team succeeds, we all succeed. And so it's a really positive environment that I haven't experienced everywhere, but I can say that this is something that in sales, you see, it takes an army to make a sale. It takes an inbound representative. It takes a closer. It takes people doing research. It takes solution architects. It takes all sorts of people to make a sale. And it's true for product development as well. If you're working on a larger design team, or you're working with product managers or engineers, it's really important to really think of yourselves as a full team. And ultimately, those relationships are your social capital. So I'll just make a point on that. And another important and really interesting thing that I've seen through this sales methodology, and also through, again, a person in particular on my team, is the attitude of how can I help others achieve their goal? So this is a picture of us at the hackathon, and the three of us were technical. I was designing, the other two were developing, and there was one guy whose sole purpose was to kind of do some sort of like business development, or to be honest, like it was kind of unclear, but he had this attitude, which is like, how can I serve you guys? How can I enable you to be the best that you can possibly be so that we can win as a team? And that's what he brought to the table. And so I've seen people bring that into product teams. There's a designer, Hen, I'll call her out, who does that specifically, where she's constantly asking how she can help other people achieve their goal. And that's something that's super powerful. And again, it doesn't directly affect her, but everyone around her really feels like she's helping uplift them. So this is something I've actually learned from a designer, but I've seen this a lot in sales teams and the way that people interact with each other in that way. So if there's a few things that I hope that we can all take out of this talk today, it's this. So the first question, and again, I really stress this because this is one of the best ways that I've seen sales and design intersect, in the high level question of how can I help my team achieve our goals? Again, selling is a team sport, designing is a team sport. And so this is something that no matter how good of a designer you are, it's important to leave your ego at the door and recognize that it takes an entire team to design and actually build a product. The second point is really making sure as a designer, if you want to be strategic, to deliver insights and value to the conversation. So in strategic sales, what really great salespeople do is they learn about the business, about the market, and about the challenges that that CTO or whoever the person with purchasing power really has, and they bring those insights to the conversation. So as a designer, again, even though I'm just a designer, right? That's one way I could look at it. But the other way is I'm here to give a consultation to my team, to be part of the team, and to add value to the conversation. So that actually includes being prepared and going past the normal, okay, product manager, tell me what to do, and I'm going to put it on a screen. But it's really understanding the entire landscape, including the personas and the competitors as well. And so that's something we've actually been able to bring into my design team at Microsoft, is a design sprint. Maybe some of you guys heard about what we're doing on Instagram, but a design sprint to actually solve some of these problems. And at first, my product manager was like, hey, you don't need to be part of this conversation, only if you want, about personas and about the competitive landscape. But I said, no, this is my role as well as part of the team to inform and bring value and insight. So this is another way that you guys can really get involved and become a strategic designer in the same way that salespeople bring forth that knowledge to their customers. And lastly, really coming prepared and understanding the challenges and be flexible and brainstorm different flexible solutions. So something that I heard really interesting in regards to sales is that, decent salespeople ask a bunch of open-ended questions and talk about challenges, but really amazing salespeople talk about these challenges and ultimately propose some flexible solutions. Obviously, they don't know everything about the industry, and it takes a team to really define this. But all in all, it's really about coming prepared and understanding what the challenges are and having some ideas of what potential solutions could be. And lastly, as I mentioned time and time again, this is one of my absolute favorite quotes. And I think this really, really brings in the topic of being a strategic salesperson and also a strategic designer as well. And something I've seen work really well on my team is that Jim Collins, who writes this amazing book about leadership, he says, you can accomplish anything in life as long as you don't mind who gets the credit. And this is what it really means to be part of a larger team and contribute to the greater success of what you're working towards building. So thanks guys so much for giving me the opportunity to share some of my insights. Let's stay connected. You can find me on Instagram, email me, LinkedIn, whatever. I'm available through all channels and hope to hear from you soon.
Woo! I'll speak in behalf of everyone, and thank you so much. Ali, could we get a few minutes of, questions for you?
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. That's really hard to construct this sentence. So I'll just read some of the things that came up in our chat. And I think it would be interesting to start with one of the questions that came last, and that came from both Elena and Peter. Both of them were saying that they recently started being interested in UX out of other fields. Elena from sales and Peter from hairstyling, and they're both saying, or asking more correctly, how would you recommend them to start this new career? How did you move from sales to UX? And do you have any notes, especially for someone that's just starting after being proficient in another industry?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm actually hosting a talk in 2 days from now, like a very small talk over Zoom, specifically on this topic. So you can DM me and I'll send you the link. Um, a lot of it just has to do with, like, for full transparency, I have been taking design courses for a long time. And even when I was in college as well, I did like a separate track within my university in graphic design. So it wasn't like a total um, like thing that I'd never seen before, although I did transition. But there's a lot of different resources through different online courses, different articles, like self-study, etc. Even if you're not coming from a design background, there's even someone in our Seattle office who came from law. So she made the transition from law, and she's found a lot of parallels between being a lawyer and being a designer. So it's definitely possible to transition. And we can talk more offline. And also you can feel free to join the Zoom conversation on Wednesday or 2 days, so Tuesday as well. And we can like go more in depth tangibly how to do so.
Sounds busy. Okay, I'm moving to another question from Asaf. So Asaf was asking if you feel that the fact that you are familiar with American culture was an important factor in your success in Israel in global companies such as Microsoft and WalkMe. And he was also asking, would you recommend some strategy for um, thinking about this, of interacting with a cultural gap between Israelis and Americans?
So it definitely was helpful. Again, in the beginning, there was a lot of challenges because, as I mentioned, with the comparison between the challenger sale and working in an Israeli company, the cultural differences are vast. We have a lot harder asserting ourselves and being that challenger in product conversations than I think Israelis do. So, in that sense, I do think that just the general mentality that we have in Israel is like more conducive to this type of collaboration. Um, Again, it's helpful being a native English speaker and having some experience, but I can say that every company I've worked for has been so different. Probably the two closest companies have been LinkedIn and Microsoft. I mean, now they're part of one company, but when I started at LinkedIn, they actually weren't. I was there during the acquisition. So I think that every place you go, it's different. And there's definitely been advantages and disadvantages to either one of them. In terms of bridging the gap, I think that it's one of those things that by speaking to people that have experience working in different types of global companies is definitely helpful. But one thing I learned early on is, and actually this was something I learned from a mentor of mine at LinkedIn, which is don't sell your experience short. A lot of people try to hide the fact that they came from a different discipline or they come from a different cultural background and they don't fit this cookie cutter mold. But what Kim Lennox, who's actually now the VP of Design at Zendesk, told me at the time when she was working at LinkedIn is it's actually really amazing to come from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different professional backgrounds, like Peter was asking. So don't hide that. Like really see how you can incorporate and tell your story about how you transitioned from one discipline to another, or how you can be successful in a global company coming from, an Israeli studio maybe, where you have more of these cultural norms that are really successful to building products already put in place from the foundation.
Okay. So next question came from Lishai. And Lishai was asking if, well, you mentioned a lot of really important qualities that you obtained as a sales rep. And she was asking if you feel that those qualities were already part of your DNA and sales was just a good fit for you, or if you feel those are skills that we can all obtain and we can all work to build.
Yeah. I think that it's a bit of both. On one hand, my dad, who I actually see is on the call, so hi, Dad, can attest. I was a really, really shy kid. Actually, I didn't like to talk to other people. I was extremely introverted, and it's actually something that is a learned skill. So my dad is very outgoing, and he like really pushed me to be more outgoing and be more in front of people. But it wasn't my nature. So it is something that can be learned. Um, on the other hand, as I did get older, a lot of people think that, talking on the phone for hours a day is terrible and the worst thing about sales. When I was doing my rotation, a lot of people complained about it. It was something that I really liked. I like connecting with people and having that interaction. So I do think it was a good fit in that way. But what I will say is that um, more than anything, it's about the skills that you can learn from it. So I feel that I did learn a lot of really valuable skills having those types of conversations, and it did fit well into my personality, although I knew it's not what I wanted to do long term. But I do think that not everyone in this room should go run off and do sales and then move back into design. I think you have to kind of know what you enjoy and then really again, like create a specialization around that, but then pull from your past experiences, like I was mentioning before. So if sales isn't your calling, like don't go and do that right now. It's enough to like watch a presentation and watch some videos on YouTube. But again, like pull from your past experiences, because all of those things, whether it be hairdressing or anything else, it can definitely benefit you as you're like launching a new career in something like this.
So to continue the conversation around new careers and doing this move into the UX profession, a question that came from Maria was around formal education. Do you feel that that's something that is a must in our industry today? And would you recommend someone to go and get formal education? And just to top that question with another question, if you have other recommendations rather than formal education, could you recommend any specific books or any specific resources?
Yeah, definitely. So I think if you can get formal education, it's always great. I know seeing the people I work with on my team that went to design school, they definitely have a really amazing grasp of visual design. And again, some of it is natural and some of it is learned. This is actually someone, Avi on my team, who is like the head of interactive at Shankar, talks about like some of it is innate and some of it is learned. It really just depends. If you can, obviously it's great, but if you can't because you're already into a career and you're kind of doing it on the side, there definitely are tons of success stories of people who didn't start as designers or didn't start as developers that ultimately move into that. There's actually do have a lot of recommendations. I won't start listing them off now, but if you follow up with me, I have like a ton of different resources that I can send you directly of things that I'm constantly reading and looking at. And the other thing is like mentorship. It's so obvious. I mean, not obvious, but it's so in our face all the time. But like startup designers have a mentor program. I've had formal mentors at my companies. I've had, indirect mentors. So people that I just kind of met along the way that have showed me like new skills and who have taught me new ways of thinking and different principles of design. So I would say all of those things are very helpful. But this mentorship program I know that Startup Designers has, I know my manager is a mentor, and he's awesome. So there's a lot of other really great people out there, and you should definitely take advantage of it.
Thank you for that.
Plug.
And by the way, if you have any resources to share that you don't mind sharing with the group, we would love to get like a recommendation post from you.
Sure, absolutely.
I can even see Michal posting it in our newsletter.
Sure, I'll definitely share.
So I want to finish with one last question, and Michal is agreeing with me. I want to finish with one last question, and that's a question from me, if it's okay. So I was wondering if you feel your experience in sales has helped you understand the business rationale behind the products, or at least the sales point of view. And if so, how would you recommend us gaining a better perspective of our products from that angle without being sales representatives?
Yeah. So I think one of the main things that you learn as a salesperson is understanding the value that the product brings to the customer, and also just kind of hearing verbatim and the voice of the user, the customer, as you're on the sales floor, selling knives, selling clothes, like selling software, whatever you're selling. So that's obviously something that's really helpful. In understanding the business, I can't say I have the strongest formal business education, although I think it gives you kind of a innate sense of like what works and what doesn't work as a product, at least at that particular time period. So I think, again, of course it's helped, but if you can't or don't want to, which I would understand, like go work directly in sales inside of an industry, there's a lot of just talking to people who work directly with customers that you can do. So for example, as I mentioned, my current team now is planning a design sprint next week with all of our stakeholders, and there's a lot of them. And one of the big things that we stress, but again, is also in this kind of like design sprint methodology, is bringing in experts. So we are bringing in 2 different experts that are customer facing, and we've prompted them with questions beforehand to understand more in depth what our customers want us to build for them. Like, it's very simple. So if you're someone who wants to design clothes, or you're someone who wants to design a certain type of retail experience, or like an app for a certain customer subset, again, this is like basic stuff. I don't think I'm saying anything new and innovative, but talk to your customers. You don't need to sell directly to them to have a conversation about what they want. You can go on the street and just ask people, like do some guerrilla market research or guerrilla user testing. That's really helpful as well. So again, you definitely don't have to work in sales to understand your customer. What I am hoping that people might have gotten out of this is really just understanding some of the skills in order to better obtain that type of information. But again, there's a lot of articles, which Shia, I promise to send you about, and then to everyone on this call, about how to ultimately speak to users and use different types of user research or like sales techniques. Again, there's a lot of parallels there in order to obtain the type of information you're looking for, either for market validation or to understand if features you've built work well or not.
That's awesome. And we're going to look for that post. So other than that, I think we're out of time. So in behalf of everyone, I want to thank you again for an amazing talk with lots of insights. Yeah, virtual claps. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being part of this amazing talk, and looking forward to see you next week, and have a happy Independence Day.
Yes, you too. Bye everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye.